Hey, John, how's it going? Today is April 4th. It's Barb's birthday. Don't forget to wish your sister a happy birthday. Give her a big ol' hug and kiss from Daddy. Um, let's see here. Today is chapter 2 of A Wrinkle in Time. I just kind of wanted to show you. It's been snowing all day. It looks real pretty out there, I think. Anywho, let's get set up. Okay. Let's see. Can you see me just fine? I got my coffee. I think. I hope. Nope. Tilt her up a little bit. There we go. Okay. So where we last left off was chapter 1. We were introduced to Meg and Charles Wallace, her little brother, their mother, and that we discovered that her father had been missing for a while. And then we were introduced to Miss What's-It. And so we're going to start at chapter 2 now. When Meg woke up to the jangling of her alarm clock, the wind was still blowing, but the sun was shining. The worst of the storm was over. She sat up in bed, shaking her head to clear it. It must have been a dream. She'd been frightened by the storm and worried about the tramp, so she just dreamed about going down to the kitchen and seeing Miss What's-It and having her mother get all frightened and upset by that word. What was it? Tess something? She dressed hurriedly, picked up the kitten still curled up on the bed, and dumped it unceremoniously on the floor. The kitten yawned, stretched, gave a piteous meow, trotted out of the attic and down the stairs. Meg made her bed and hurried after it. In the kitchen, her mother was making French toast, and the twins were already at the table. The kitten was lapping milk out of a saucer. "Where's Charles?" Meg asked. "Still asleep. We had rather an interruption. Still asleep. We rather had. Bleh. It's okay. It's okay. Still asleep. We had rather an interrupted night, if you remember." "I hoped it was a dream," Meg said. Her mother carefully turned over 4 slices of French toast, then said in a steady voice, "No, Meg, don't hope it was a dream. I don't understand it any more than you do. But one thing I've learned is that you don't have to understand things for them to be. I'm sorry I showed you I was upset. Your father and I used to have a joke about tesseract." "What is a tesseract?" Meg asked. "It's a concept." Miss Murray handed the twins the syrup. "I'll try to explain it to you later. There isn't time before school." "I don't see why you didn't wake us up," Dennis said. It's a jip we missed out on all the fun." "You'll be a lot more awake in school today than I will." Meg took her French toast off to the table. "Who cares?" Sandy said. "If you're going to let old tramps come into the house in the middle of the night, Mother, you ought to have Den and me around to protect you. After all, Father would expect us to," Dennis said. "We know you have a great mind and all, Mother," Sandy said, "but you don't have much sense. And certainly Meg and Charles don't." "I know. We're morons." Meg was bitter. "I wish you wouldn't be such a dope, Meg. Syrup, please." Sandy reached across the table. "You don't have to take everything so personally. Use a happy medium, for heaven's sake. You just goof around in school and look out the window, and you don't pay any attention." "You just make things harder for yourself," Dennis said. "And Charles Wallace is going to have an awful time next year when he starts school. We know he's bright, but he's so funny when he's around other people, and they're so used to thinking he's dumb. I don't know what's going to happen to him. Sandy and I'll sock anyone who picks on him, but that's about all we can do. Let's not worry about next year till we get through this one," Miss Murray said. "More French toast, boys?" At school, Meg was tired and her eyelids sagged, and her mind wandered. In social studies, she was asked to name the principal imports and exports of Nicaragua, and though she had looked them up Dutifully, the evening before, now she could remember none of them. The teacher was sarcastic, the rest of the class laughed, and she flung herself down in her seat in a fury. Who cares about the imports and exports of Nicaragua anyhow? She muttered. If you're gonna be rude, Margaret, you may leave the room, the teacher said. Okay, I will. Meg flounced out. During study hall, the principal sent for her. What seems to be the problem now, Meg? He asked, pleasantly enough. Meg looked sulkingly down at the floor. Nothing, Mr. Jenkins. Miss Porter tells me you were inexcusably rude. Sorry about that. Meg shrugged. Don't you realize that you just make everything harder for yourself by your attitude? The principal asked. Now, Meg, I'm convinced that you can do the work and keep up with your grade if you will apply yourself. But some of your teachers are not. You're going to have to do something about yourself. Nobody can do it for you. Meg was silent. Well, what about it, Meg? I don't know what to do, Meg said. You could do your homework, for one thing. Wouldn't your mother help you? If I asked her to. Meg, is something troubling you? Are you unhappy at home? Mr. Jenkins asked. At last Meg looked at him, pushing her glasses, a characteristic gesture. Everything's fine at home. I'm glad to hear it, but I know it must be hard on you to have your father away. Meg eyed the principal warily and ran her tongue over her barbed line of her braces. Have you had any news from him lately? Meg was sure it was not only imagination that made her feel that behind Mr. Jenkins' surface concern was a gleam of avid curiosity. Wouldn't he like to know, she thought, and if I knew anything, he's the last person I'd tell. Well, one of the last. The postmistress must know that it's almost a year now since the last letter, and heaven knows many people she'd told, or what unkind guesses she'd made about the reason for the long silence. Mr. Jenkins waited for an answer, but Meg only shrugged. Just what was your father's line of business? Mr. Jenkins asked. Some kind of scientist, wasn't he? He's a physicist. Meg bared her teeth to reveal the two ferocious lines of braces. Meg, don't you think you'd make a better adjustment to life if you face facts? I do face facts, Meg said. They're lots easier to face than people, I can tell you. Then why don't you face facts about your father? You leave my father out of it, Meg shouted. Stop bellowing, Mr. Jenkins said sharply. Do you want the entire school to hear you? So what? She demanded. I'm not ashamed of anything I'm saying. Are you? Mr. Jenkins sighed. Do you enjoy being the most belligerent, uncooperative child in school? Meg ignored this. She leaned over the desk towards the principal. Mr. Jenkins, you've met my mother, haven't you? You can't accuse her of not facing facts, can you? She's a scientist. She has doctor's degrees in both biology and bacteriology. Her business is facts. When she tells me that my father isn't coming home, I'll believe it. As long as she says father is coming home, then I'll believe that. Mr. Jenkins sighed again. No doubt your mother wants to believe that your father is coming home, Meg. Very well. I can't do anything else with you. Go on back to study hall. Try to be a little less antagonistic. Maybe your work will improve if your general attitude were more tractable. Get a little sip of my coffee. When Meg got home from school, her mother was in the lab. The twins were at Little League, and Charles Wallace, the kitten, and Fortinbras were waiting for her. Fortinbras jumped up, put his front paws on her shoulders, and gave her a kiss. And the kitten rushed to his empty saucer and mewed loudly. Come on, Charles Wallace said. Let's go. Where? Meg asked. I'm hungry, Charles. I don't want to go anywhere until I've had something to eat. She was still sore from the interview with Mr. Jenkins, and her voice sounded cross. Charles Wallace looked at her thoughtfully as she went to the refrigerator and gave the kitten some milk, then drank a mugful herself. He handed her a paper bag. Here's a sandwich and some cookies and an apple. I thought we'd better go see Miss Whatsit. Oh, golly, Meg said. Why, Charles? You're still uneasy about her, aren't you? Charles asked. Well, yes. Don't be. She's all right. I promise you. She's on our side. How do you know? Meg, he said impatiently. I know. But why should we go see her now? I want to find out more about the Tesseract thing. Didn't you see how it upset Mother? You know when Mother can't control the way she feels. When she lets us see she's upset, then it's something big. Meg thought for a moment. Okay, let's go. But let's take Fortinbras with us. Well, of course, he needs the exercise. They set off. Fortinbras rushed ahead, then doubling back to the children, then leaping off again. The Murrays lived about 4 miles out of the village. Behind the house was a pine woods, and it was through this that Charles Wallace took Meg. Charles, you know she's going to get in awful trouble. Miss Whatsit, I mean, if they found out she's broken into the haunted house and taking Miss Buncombe's sheets and everything, they could send her to jail. One of the reasons I want to go over this afternoon is to warn them. Them? I told you she was there with her 2 friends. I'm not even sure it was Miss Whatsit herself who took the sheets. I thought I wouldn't put it past her. Though I wouldn't put it past her. It's alright to misread something. You just gotta make sure you do it right. But what would she want all those sheets for? I intend to ask her, Charles Wallace said, and to tell them they'd better be more careful. I don't really think they'll let anybody find them. But I just thought we ought to mention the possibility. Sometime during vacation, some of the boys will go down out here looking for thrills. But I don't think anybody's apt to that right now, with the basketball and everything. They walked in silence for a moment through the fragrant woods, the rusty pine needles gentle under their feet. Up above them the wind made music in the branches. Charles Wallace slipped his hand confidingly in Meg's, and the sweet little boy gestured warmed her, so that she felt the tense knot inside her begin to loosen. Charles loves me at any rate, she thought. School awful again today? He asked after a while. Yes. I got sent to Mr. Jenkins. He made snide remarks about Father. Charles Wallace nodded sagely. I know. How? Do you know? Charles Wallace shook his head. I can't quite explain it. You tell me, that's all. But I never said anything. You just seem to know. Everything about you tells me. Charles said. Well, how about the twins? Meg asked. Do you know about them too? I suppose I could if I wanted to, if they needed me, but it's sort of tiring, so I just concentrate on you and Mother. You mean you read our minds? Charles Wallace looked troubled. I don't think it's that. It's being able to understand a sort of language. Like sometimes if I concentrate very hard, I can understand the wind talking to the trees. You tell me. You see, sort of inadvertently. That's a good word, isn't it? I got Mother to look it up in the dictionary for me this morning. I really must learn to read, except I'm afraid it will make it awfully hard for me in school next year if I already know things. I think it will be better if people go on thinking I'm not very bright. They won't hate me quite so much. Ahead of them, Fortinbras started barking loudly, the warning bay that usually told them a car was coming up the road or that someone was at the door. Somebody's here, Charles Wallace said sharply. Somebody's hanging around the house. Come on. He started to run, his short legs straining. At the edge of the woods, Fortinbras stood in front of a boy, barking furiously. As they came panting up, the boy said, for crying out loud, call off your dog. Who is he? Charles Wallace asked Meg. Calvin O'Keefe. He's in regional, but he's older than I am. He's a big bug. It's all right, fella. I'm not going to hurt you, the boy said to Fortinbras. Sit, Fort, Charles Wallace commanded, and Fortinbras dropped to his haunches in front of the boy, a low growl still pulsing in his dark throat. Okay, Charles Wallace put his hand on his hips. Now tell us what you're doing here. I might ask you the same, the boy said with the same indignation. Aren't you two of the Murray kids? This isn't your property, is it? He started to move, but Fortinbras' growl grew louder, and he stopped. Tell me about him, Meg, Charles Wallace demanded. What would I know about him? Meg asked. He's a couple grades above me, and he's on the basketball team. Just because I'm tall? Calvin sounded a little embarrassed. Tall he certainly was, and skinny. His bony wrists stuck out of the sleeves of his blue sweater. His worn corduroy trousers were 3 inches too short. He had orange hair and needed cutting, and the appropriate freckles to go with it. His eyes were an oddly bright blue. Tell us what you're doing here, Charles Wallace said. What is this, the 3rd degree? Aren't you the one who's supposed to be the moron? Meg flushed with rage, but Charles Wallace answered placidly. That's right. If you want me to call off my dog, you better give. Most particular moron I've ever met, Calvin said. I just came to get away from my family. Charles Wallace nodded. What kind of family? They all have runny noses. I'm 3rd from the top of 11 kids. I'm a sport. At that, Charles Wallace grinned wildly. So am I. I mean, I don't mean like in basketball, Calvin said. Neither do I. I mean like in biology, Calvin said suspiciously. A change in gene, Charles Wallace quoted, resulting in the appearance of the offspring of a character which is not present in the parents, but which is potentially transmissible to its offspring. What gives around here? Calvin asked. I was told you couldn't talk. Thinking I'm a moron gives people something to feel smug about, Charles Wallace said. Why should I disillusion them? How old are you, Cal? 14. What grade? Junior, 11th. I'm bright. Listen, did anybody ask you to come here this afternoon? Charles Wallace, holding Fort by the collar, looked at Calvin suspiciously. What do you mean, asked? Calvin shrugged. You still don't trust me, do you? I don't distrust you, Charles Wallace said. Do you want to tell me why you're here then? Fort and Meg and I decided to go for a walk. We often do that in the afternoon. Calvin dug his hands down in his pockets. You're holding out on me. So are you, Charles Wallace said. Okay, old sport, Calvin said. I'll tell you this much. Sometimes I get a feeling about things. You might call it a compulsion. Do you know what compulsion means? Constraint, obligation, because one is compelled. Not a very good definition, but it's concise, Oxford. It's the concise Oxford. Okay, Calvin sighed. I must remember I'm preconditioned in my concept of your mentality. Meg sat down on the coarse grass at the edge of the woods. Fort gently whistled, twisted his collar out of Charles Wallace's hands, and came over to Meg, lying down beside her and putting his head in her lap. Calvin tried now politely to direct his words towards Meg as well as Charles Wallace. When I get this feeling, this compulsion, I always do what it tells me. I can't explain where it comes from or how I get it, and it doesn't happen very often, but I obey it. And this afternoon, I had a feeling that I must come over to the haunted house. That's all I know, kid. I'm not holding anything back. Maybe it's because I'm supposed to meet you. You tell me. Charles Wallace looked at Calvin probingly for a moment. Then an almost glazed look came into his eyes, and he seemed to be thinking at him. Calvin stood very still and waited. At last Charles Wallace said, Okay, I believe you, but I can't tell you. I think I'd like to trust you. Maybe you better come home with us and have dinner. Well, sure, but what would your mother say to that? Calvin asked. She'd be delighted. Mother's all right. She's not one of us, but she's all right. What about Meg? Meg has it tough, Charles Wallace said. She's not really one thing or the other. What do you mean, one of us? Meg demanded. What do you mean I'm not one thing or the other? Not now, Meg, Charles Wallace said. Slowly. I'll tell you about it later. He looked at Calvin, then seemed to make a quick decision. Okay, let's take him to meet Miss What's-It. If he's not okay, she'll know. He started off on his short legs toward the dilapidated house. The haunted house was half in the shadows of the clump of elms in which it stood. The elms were almost bare now, and the ground around the house was yellow with damp leaves. The late afternoon light had a greenish cast, which the blank windows reflected in a sinister way. An unhinged shutter thumped. Something else creaked. Meg did not wonder that the house had a reputation for being haunted. More coffee? Okie dokie. Do. A board was nailed across the front door, but Charles Wallace led the way around the back. The door there appeared to be nailed shut too, but Charles Wallace knocked, and the door swung slowly outward, creaking on rusty hinges. Up in one of the elms, an old black crow gave its raucous cry. Does not work with phonics, that word. Raucous cry, and a woodpecker went into a wild rat-tat-tat-tat-tat. A large gray rat scuttled around the corner of the house, and Meg let out a stifled shriek. They get a lot of fun out of using all the typical props, Charles Wallace said in a reassuring voice. Come on, follow me. Calvin put a strong hand to Megan's elbow, and Fort pressed against her leg. Happiness at their concern was so strong in her that panic fled, and she followed Charles Wallace into the dark recesses of the house without fear. They entered into a sort of kitchen. There was a huge fireplace with a black pot hanging over a merry fire. Why had there been no smoke visible from the chimney? Something in the pot was bubbling, and it smelled more like one of Mrs. Murphy's chemical messes than something to eat. In a dilapidated Boston rocker sat a plump little woman. She wasn't Miss Whatsit, so she must, Meg decided, be one of Miss Whatsit's two friends. She wore enormous spectacles, twice as thick and twice as large as Meg's, and she was sewing busily, with rapid jabbing stitches on a sheet. Several other sheets lay on the dusty floor. Charles Wallace went up to her. I really don't think you ought to have taken Miss Buncombe's sheets without consulting me, he said, as cross and bossy as only a very little small boy can be. What on earth do you want them for? The plump little woman beamed at him. Why, Charlesy, my pet, the heart has its reasons, whereof reasons know nothing at all. But that's not appropriate at all, Charles said crossly. Your mother would find it so. A smile seemed to gleam through the roundness of spectacles. I'm not talking about my mother's feelings. About my father, Charles Wallace scolded. I'm talking about Miss Buncombe's sheets. The little woman sighed. The enormous glasses caught the light again and shone like an owl's eyes. In case we need ghosts, of course, she said. I should think you'd have guessed. If we have to frighten anybody away, what's it thought we ought to do it appropriately? That's why it's so much fun to stay in a haunted house. But we really didn't mean you to know about the sheets. Caught in the act. So, I'm skipping a little bit because I don't know how to read German or Latin, and she is quoting things in different languages and then they transfer them to English. So she was saying, I've been caught in the act. As I was saying, but Charles Wallace held up his hand in a peremptory gesture. Miss Who, do you know this boy? Calvin bowed. Good afternoon, ma'am. I didn't quite catch your name. Miss Who will do, the woman said. She wasn't my idea, Charlesy, but I think he's a good one. Where's Miss Whatsit? Charles asked. She's busy. It's getting near time, Charlesy, getting near time. Nothing deters a good man from doing what is honorable. And he's a very good man, Charlesy, darling. But right now, he needs our help. Who? Meg demanded. And little Megsy. Lovely to meet you, sweetheart. Your father, of course. Now go home, loves. The time is not right. Don't worry. We don't go without you. Get plenty of food and rest. Feed Calvin up. Now off with you. Latin again, of course. Faith is the sister of justice. Trust in us. Now shoot! And she fluttered up from her chair and pushed them out the door with surprising power. Charles, Meg said, I don't understand. Charles took her by the hand and dragged her away from the house. Fortinbras ran on ahead, and Calvin was close behind them. "No," he said. "I don't either. Yet. Not quite. I'll tell you what I know soon as I can. But you saw Fort, didn't you? Not a growl. Not a quiver. Just as though they weren't anything strange about it. So you know it's okay. Look, do me a favor, both of you. Let's not talk about this till we've had something to eat. I need fuel so I can sort things out and assimilate them properly." "Lead on, moron," Calvin cried gaily. "I've never even seen your house, and I have the funniest feeling that for the first time in my life I'm going home." Alright, so that's the end of Chapter 2. We will continue on to Chapter 3 tomorrow with Mrs. Witch. I love you, kiddo. Get some sleep. I hope you had a wonderful day. And we will continue this book later. Dropped in my phone. Love you, kiddo. Bye-bye.